Einen schönen guten Abend. Dann würden wir beginnen, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Mein Name ist Stefan Lessenich, ich bin Direktor des Instituts für Sozialforschung und ich begrüße Sie sehr herzlich zu den diesjährigen Adorno-Vorlesungen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me and actually an exceptional honor to welcome tonight Loïc Wacquant, who most fortunately has accepted our invitation to hold this year's Adorno lectures and who happily has found his way after a somewhat rocky trip from San Francisco to Frankfurt and to this beautiful lecture hall. Let me shortly introduce Professor Wacquant to you. Loïc Wacquant, and don't trust Wikipedia, he corrected this in my manuscript. I'll keep that for until the end of my life. Loïc Wacquant was born in Nîmes, really beautiful Nîmes, and he grew up in really beautiful Montpellier. He received his academic education first in economics at the École des Hautes Études Commerciales de Paris, and afterwards in sociology at the Université Paris-Nanterre and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Continuing his career in the United States, he received his PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago and has been for quite some years now a professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, where he is affiliated with at least the Center for the Study of Law and Society, the Global Metropolitan Studies Program, the Institute of Governmental Studies, the Center for Race and Gender, and the Center for Ethnographic Research. Apart from this, he is also a research associate at the Centre Européen de Sociologie et de Sciences Politiques in Paris. His multiple affiliations are the formal and institutional reflection of the truly and profoundly interdisciplinary character of Professor Wacquant's academic trajectory and research program. His theoretical as well as empirical work is located at the intersections of sociology, anthropology, urban studies, social theory, and philosophy, to name only the 5 most obvious disciplinary alignments and orientations. On his personal website, Loïc Wacquant characterizes himself as, I quote, a sociologist who tries to wed epistemology, ethnography, social theory, and comparison to capture the carnality of social existence, the structure, dynamics, and experience of urban marginality, the making of the penal state and the rise of neoliberalism, the specificity of ethno-racial domination, and the predicament of the precariat, end of quote. Deeply interested in the nexus between class, race, and space, his work may be said to have been intersectional avant la lettre, before intersectionality was coined as a theoretical concept and established as an analytical perspective in gender and inequality research. Professor Wacquant is an really incredibly prolific writer and thus author of a vast range of books and papers. I'm restricting myself to point here in a completely arbitrary selection to only a handful of his major book publications. An Introduction to Reflexive Sociology, Reflexive Anthropologie in German, co-authored with Pierre Bourdieu and published in 1992, the University of Chicago Press. Punishing the Poor, the Neoliberal Government of Social Insecurity, Bestrafen der Armen, published with Duke University Press in 2009, the same year in which Professor Wacquant received the Louis A. Coase Award of the theory section of the American Sociological Association. More recently, he published The Invention of the Underclass, a study in the politics of knowledge, Die Erfindung der Unterklasse, with Polity Press 2022, and only some months ago, and again with Polity, his, as far as I see, last book entitled Racial Domination. As is well known, Loïc Wacquant has been a student and a close collaborator back in the 1980s of Pierre Bourdieu. This intellectual exchange has left its traces in his distinct and genuine way of thinking and arguing, of conceptualizing the social world, and not least, of performing sociology. Loïc arguably is, as you will repeatedly see in his presentations these next days, the king of the handcrafted sociological sketch, moving well beyond and actually deconstructing the classical Personian four-field matrix. He consistently thinks, as we will also have the opportunity to witness and enjoy in only a few minutes, he consistently thinks in terms of divisions, oppositions, dualities, polarities, bifurcations, antagonisms, structural tensions, and, most importantly, their interplay and mediation. Smells like Frankfurt spirit, I'm tempted to say, like dialectics Wacquantian style. With this lecture series to be presented here in Frankfurt on rethinking the penal state, and starting tonight with this talk on penality as a core state capacity and negative sociodicy, Loïc Wacquant will generously be sharing with us the quintessence of a decades-long preoccupation with the social sufferings of marginal or marginalized populations, sufferings that are inextricably social in their constitution, reproduction, and, who knows, resolution. On behalf of the Institute of Social Research and of Suhrkamp Publishers, I'm happy to leave the floor now to Loïc Wacquant, to borrow a concept coined by Friedrich Engels, the ideal total sociologist, and for that matter, the ideal material sociologist, the theorist of practice and practitioner of theory. I hereby declare the 2024 Adorno Lectures open. May the games begin.
Thank you for this generous introduction, and thank you for coming tonight. I don't always assume that there will be an audience when I would like to speak, so it's a pleasure to see this room. I would like to thank the Institut für Sozialforschung for their kind and intimidating invitation to give the 2024 Adorno Vorlesungen, especially Stefan Lesnich and Almut Popinga, who behind the scenes have made this visit possible. When I was an undergraduate student at the University of Paris in the 1980s, I had an abiding fascination for the Frankfurt School. So it is truly exciting for me to be here, and I hope that my inner joy allows me to give 3 lectures that are worthy of the name and that hold your attention. So my 3 lectures are going to be on rethinking the penal state. And I'm going to combine social theory, social history, and ethnography to probe criminal punishment as a core function of the state. In lecture 1, I will mine social theory to construct a robust concept of the penal state. In lecture 2, I will turn to social history to try to grab the resurgence of the prison in the neoliberal era and its relationship to class, ethnicity, and territory. And in the 3rd lecture, I will turn to ethnography to take you deep into a California criminal court and to capture penality as carnal collective action. And I'm going to argue that by rolling out the police, the court, and the prison and their bureaucratic tentacles, the penal state curates crime, contains socio-moral disorders, manages urban marginality, and effectively draws the boundaries of civic membership. Tracking the penal state will reveal its distinctive structure. It is polarized, it is Janus-faced, and it is bifurcated. All 3 notions that probably have you thinking, like, what does he mean? Well, precisely, come to the lectures, and you will then understand what these 3 adjectives refer to. I am particularly interested in capturing how the building of the neoliberal Leviathan with its expanded punishment apparatus, impacts the formation and the fate of the precariat, the precarious fractions of the post-industrial proletariat trapped in the neighborhoods of relegation of the dualizing metropolis, who are the privileged target of the penal state. But I'm going to argue that the relevance of penality as a core state capacity goes far beyond the populations that are processed by the police, the courts, and the prison, because the penal state stamps social and symbolic space at large. In a sense, the penal state is not just about the criminals. It's about you all in this room, because the definition of the criminal serves to define who is a worthy citizen. So the criminal and the citizen are co-constructed in discourse and materiality. Historians have shown that by defining the criminal and how to treat him, the penal state defines the citizen by contraposition. Thus, in his account of changes in criminal law in Victorian England, reconstructing the criminal, cultural law and policy in England 1830 to 1914, Martin Joel Wiener demonstrates how the re-evaluation of the offender in English law and culture redefined the figure of the full-fledged member of the national community. And this is not just a European peculiarity. The same argument is made by historians of crime, punishment, and politics in Latin America, such as Pablo Picato in his great book, City of Suspects, Crime in Mexico City, 1900-1931. You know, and if I had to summarize today's lecture in just a couple of sentences, I would say, follow the criminal and you will find the citizen. And then I will say also that the penal state, and this is a surprise it was a surprise to me as I worked on the lectures, contains both Immanuel Kant's conception of punishment as retribution and Jeremy Bentham's conception of punishment as a rational device to alter the behavior of the criminal. So in a sense, in the penal state, we see Kant meets Bentham. So that's tonight's agenda. So I want to suggest also that the penal state is a distinctively urban institution. It is designed and rolled out in the city to corral and control the problem populations that coalesce in the underbelly of the city. This was true at the end of the 16th century when the House of Corrections was invented. It is equally true at the end of the 20th century as the prison expands again. So I will not have the time to fully develop the argument about the urban nature of the penal state, but I wanted to have a shout out for students of the city that they can no longer continue to ignore the penal state. So in this title, under the title Penality as Core State Capacity and Negative Sociodicy, this opening lecture takes a social theoretical approach. Let me just give you a brief preview. I will start with the puzzle of mutual ignorance. With precious few exceptions, among them Thomas Hobbes, theorists of punishment, past and present, have neglected the state, while theorists of the state, past and present, have neglected punishment. I bring these two theoretical strands together to argue that penalty is a core state capacity, an indispensable institutionalized means of public action, and that you cannot grasp the state without grasping punishment and vice versa. Pacifying social space and installing a functioning triad of police, court, and prison are a sine qua non of modern state building. So I will selectively canvass theories of punishment from Durkheim to Rouch to Foucault, and then I'll canvass theories of the state from Max Weber to Michael Mann to James Scott to Pierre Bourdieu, and I will show that the opposition between rationalist and emotionalist theories of punishment, Kant and Bentham, is mirrored by the opposition between the Benthamite and the Kantian philosophies of punishment, mandated reformation on the one hand and retribution on the other hand. I will resolve this opposition by spotlighting the constitutive duality of criminal sanction, at once material and symbolic, an instrument of class control and a means of communicating community values, endlessly oscillating between rehabilitation and retribution. And I will argue that in a sense that in liberal democratic societies, this is a constitutive property of the penal state. I will elaborate an analytic concept of the penal state as a specialized sector of the bureaucratic field, entrusted with interpreting and enforcing criminal statutes, thus putting the law to work to foster social and moral order. And like the state itself, the penal sector is animated by a structural tension between the masculine right hand of discipline and the feminine left hand of protection. It is also riven by a patterned struggle over the very definition of justice, oscillating, as I've indicated, between retribution and redemption. Then I go beyond materialist perspective to stress the symbolic purpose of criminal punishment as public disgrace. The purpose of punishment is to brighten the boundary of citizenship and to legitimize the social and moral dereliction of marginal categories in the double order of class and status. Properly conceived, then, penality is what I will characterize as a form of negative sociodicy, a secular theodicy of misfortune in Max Weber's sense of the term. Then I will conclude by spotlighting three structural properties of the penal state. It is polarized by the tension between punitive autonomy and protective heteronomy. It is Janus-faced in that it simultaneously delivers a public good for the citizenry, safety on the streets, but a private bad for the criminal, physical and psychic pain. And it is lastly bifurcated by class, ethnicity, and place. This bifurcation, I will argue, is not an incidental or an accidental property of the penal leviathan, but a structural property of the penal state, which of course raises vexing questions of justice, reform, and civic justice. So, lecture number one today, penality as core state capacity and negative sociodicy. Actually, I'll stay on that slide for now. So in 1933, a brilliant young scholar by the name of Georg Rusche, trained in philosophy of law, economics, and social science at Göttingen, published an article in the second issue of the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, the journal just launched by the Institut for Sozialforschung. The short article was entitled Arbeitsmacht und Strafvollzug. It laid out the lineaments of a book commissioned by the Institute as part of its intellectual agenda to expand the parameters of Marxist analysis, to encompass and to critique all the major institutions of bourgeois society. The book, which would appear 6 years later in the United States, co-signed with Otto Kirchheimer as Punishment and Social Structure, argues that there exists a one-to-one correspondence between the mode of production and the mode of punishment across 8 centuries of Western history. Now, the 1933 article and the 1939 book fell into immediate oblivion due to the coming of power of the Nazis, the subsequent exile of the Frankfurt School, and the outbreak of World War II, only to be rediscovered in the 1970s in the United States and Europe and promptly canonized as the Marxist approach to punishment. One can argue that it is more Weberian than Marxist, since it recognizes the role of religion, fiscal capacity, and even sexuality in the formation of penal policy, but it is certainly historical and materialist, and so it spawned a strand of inquiry known as the political economy of punishment, whose favorite topic is the relationship between the labor market and incarceration. For this lineage, punishment is a rational response by capitalists to the challenges of labor in terms of abundance, discipline, and militancy. It is an instrument of class control. But Rusche was not the first to pose the question of the connection between penality and society. In his discussion of crime and the law in De la Division du Travail Social, the division of labor in society, in 1893, and in his formulation of the 2 laws of penal evolution published in 1902, the founder of French sociology, Émile Durkheim, had proposed that punishment is a revelator of the state of social cohesion, and its application a means of revivifying solidarity. Penal sanctions for Durkheim stoke and direct collective emotions towards the offenders whose misbehavior accentuates the boundaries between insiders and outsiders. These 2 texts uncovered the communicative function of punishment and initiated a tradition of research that stresses the ritualized, ceremonial, and phatic nature of criminal sanction. In short, the symbolic dimension of penalty. In this tradition, the penal state is a structurally benevolent contraption that coordinates societal needs and deploys sanctions to mark difference and to produce social cohesion. finally we get to this slide. It is conventional in studies of penality to oppose these two approaches, the materialist and the symbolic, descended from Marx after Bentham and Durkheim after Kant, respectively. Indeed, they paint two pictures of criminal justice that seem seemingly irreconcilable, and they ask their reader to take sides. In my book, Punishing the Poor, Bestrafen der Armen, I make one simple but critical move. I join rather than oppose these two paradigms. The rationale for rejecting this opposition is that in advanced societies, punishment is a complex, multi-layered, and versatile institution such that it can simultaneously or alternately obey a rational logic in one sector and an emotional logic in another. It can reinforce class control and draw community boundaries. It can respond to changes in the economy and react to the diffusion of status anxiety. It can affect the control of labor and assuage collective sentiments. So in the three lectures I will give this week before you, I propose to mate the materialist, Benthamite, rationalist, control-oriented approach to the symbolic, Kantian, emotionalist, community-forming approach to criminal sanction, to elaborate a robust concept of the penal state rooted in Pierre Bourdieu's theory of fields and symbolic power. And let me start with a puzzle, the puzzle of mutual ignorance. Students of the state do not much care about punishment, and students of punishment are oblivious to state theory. So I propose to remix penality and the state to show that punishment is central to statecraft and that the city and the penal state grow together. First, consider the conspicuous absence of penality in theories of the state. One illustration, the Oxford Handbook of the Transformation of the State, published in 2015 by a multidisciplinary team of distinguished scholars from 4 countries. Among the topics receiving a full chapter under the crucial issues rubric, we find the overhaul of the welfare state, gender equality, the regulatory state, and migration, but not a word on criminal justice, despite the stunning growth and explosive political sensitivity of punishment over the past half-century, as evidenced by the international spread of penal populism. Not a word on the sudden resurgence of the prison in nearly all advanced societies after the mid-1970s, which will be the topic of my second lecture tomorrow, and you're cordially invited. Second, consider the absence of the state in theories of punishment. One illustration, the Sage Handbook of Punishment and Society, edited by Jonathan Simon and Richard Sparks, a book I warmly recommend it, it's really excellent. Mapping out this fast expanding new arena of research, contains just a few lines on the state. The book scans 7 theoretical approaches to penality, only one of which makes room for the role of the Leviathan, the approach inspired by Norbert Elias. But even that chapter spotlights the cultural, cognitive, and libidinal dimension of the civilizing process and gives short shrift to the monopolization of force and the law by the state. It is dispatched in just a couple of lines. So I want to argue for the centrality of the state. I know it's not a very fashionable theoretical proposition today, but I wish to reassert the centrality of the state in the production of social order and the management of urban marginality, a key focus of public action ever since the birth of the penal prison and the modern police. Individual practices, group strategies, and diffuse organizational mechanisms feeding Foucauldian governmentality are always deployed in the long shadow of the state. Moreover, in contemporary society, governmentality is a modality of power deeply inflected by class and ethnicity. I have a long argument about that, kind of parrying off the counter-arguments of the Foucauldians with their notion of governmentality. Let me just say, to put it crudely, that in the dual metropolis, the bourgeoisie gets governmentality, while the precariat gets the penal state. At minimum, the state must be perceived as enforcing the law and producing public safety and tranquility on the street, for that is the key to the prosaic projection of sovereignty in the city. When other actors are brought into the security loop, individuals, households, firms, they extend but do not replace the power of the Leviathan. Private operators, such as private police that have developed in many countries, taking part in punishment via revocable delegation. They do not challenge the state's monopoly, but affirm it by operating strictly within its ambit. Civil society outfits, such as crime victims associations, also orient themselves towards the state and end up reinforcing its prerogatives even as they decry its failings. In short, penalty is both the duty and the perquisite of the state. So let me now turn to the social theorists who can help us elaborate this proposition. And first, I'll start with theorists of punishment, Durkheim, Rouche, and Foucault on penalty. Now, Durkheim is the first sociologist to give us essential tools for thinking about penalty and its social springs. And I'll sum up his contribution in 5 propositions. First, punishment is an emotional response. It is the normal reaction of the collectivity to violations of its sanctified rule of conduct. Its delivery is entrusted to the state and within the state to special organs tasked with justice. Its form may change, but its function is invariant. Punishment is a passionate reaction of graduated intensity whereby society avenges, quote, the outrage to morality and maintains social cohesion intact. Indeed, he says, vengeance is the soul of penalty. Punishment consists in this passionate reaction of graduated intensity which society exercises through the agency of a constituted body upon whose members who have violated certain rules of conduct. Second proposition, that punishment is an act of vengeance does, however euphemized, does not mean that its main target is the offender. In a stunning inversion, Durkheim proposes that punishment, quote, is above all designed to act upon law-abiding people, les honnêtes gens. Third proposition, another striking statement, Durkheim proposes that punishment is a communicative device, quote, a notation, a language through which the public conscience of society expresses the sentiment that the reproved act inspires among its members. Fourth proposition, punishment draws the boundary of community and revivifies social solidarity. It articulates the opposition between us and them and reaffirms normative principles by singling out those who violate them for opprobrium. This is where Emile Durkheim meets Carl Schmitt's concept of the political as the opposition between the friend and the enemy. Penalty is very much about drawing a boundary between the friend and the enemy. And fifth proposition, very briefly, since penal reaction varies in accordance with, quote, the vivacity of the offended sentiments, for Durkheim, there is a kind of a natural process of adaptation of punishment, the seriousness of punishment to the seriousness of the crime. And he says the proportionality that is observed everywhere between crime and punishment is established with mechanical spontaneity without the needs for scholarly supputations to calculate it. So passionate reaction, communicative device, produces solidarity, the opposition between us and them. Those are the key ideas that we take from Durkheim. Now let's move on to Georg Rouche on the mode of punishment. The materialist approach to the law, initiated by Marx and Engels and famously elaborated by Rouche and Kirchheimer in Punishment and Society, Punishment and Social Structure, is in every respect diametrically opposed to the Durkheimian approach. For the Marxists and their allies, punishment is a rational instrument of class control as demonstrated by 4 propositions. First, crime is a direct consequence of economic oppression and material deprivation. While it is true that offenses are committed by people across the social structure, it is equally clear, and I quote Rouche, criminal law and the daily work of the criminal courts are directed almost exclusively against those people whose class background, poverty, neglected education, and demoralization led them to crime, end of quote. Second, the historical analysis of penalty must imperatively supplement economic analysis. Then it will discover that, quote, every system of production tends to discover punishments which corresponds to its productive relationship. This is this idea of the correspondence between mode of production and mode of punishment. Third proposition, the transformation of penal practices across the centuries reveals that punishment has varied in keeping with the scarcity or surplus of labor. When workers are scarce and thus valuable, society moves away from corporal punishment and in incarceration. Now, Rouch is very aware of the analytic limitations of Marxism when it comes to accounting for penal policy. But, for instance, insists on the role of religious, sexual phenomena, the fiscal capacity of the state, so this is why I say that Rouch is, is kind of more a Weberian than a Marxist, but he's been canonized as the apostle of the Marxist theory of punishment, so we have to live with that image. Now, in a neglected passage of Arbeitsmacht und Strafvollzug, Rouch asserts that the materialist approach has not sufficiently considered, quote, the impact of the sense of honor and the fear of disgrace associated with punishment. The German legal scholar continues with this passage that echoes Durkheim's stress on the psychosocial effects of criminal sanction and Weber's concern with their legitimacy. He writes, the solidity of the social structure does in no way depend only on the strength of external measures of coercion, which are supposed to guarantee the continuation of society. The great majority of people has to be psychically willing to accommodate to the existing society, to regard the state as their state, the law as their law. But according to experience, there are classes for whom this adjustment and identification break down. And we're going to see these are precisely the classes to which the penal state is oriented. These are precisely the classes which are punished by the penal state, are the ones who do not regard the state as their state, the law as their law. Now let's move on to Foucault. Is that Foucault on the? Oh no, that's the Rouch citation. You can look at the part that's bolded, and so let's move on to Foucault. So Foucault on the discipline. So Foucault is a complicated, elusive writer. I'm going to focus on the Foucault of surveiller et punir, überwachen und strafen, from whom I will extract 5 propositions. First, for Foucault, there's an abrupt transition in modernity from sovereignty to the spider web of disciplines. Between 1760 and 1840, an abrupt shift took place in European societies from the centralized, negative political juridical power of the sovereign to the diffuse positive biopower of disciplines, from spectacular torture targeting the body to invisible incarceration targeting the soul. And this produces the disciplinary individual and the disciplinary society. Second, the aim of those disciplines is to make bodies useful and docile, 2 properties that dynamically reinforce each other. Many disciplinary procedures have a long history with roots in convents, armies, and factories. But in the 18th century, they became, quote, general formulas for domination that spread across myriad institutions where they spawned bodies of specialized knowledge that in turn reinforced power, thus the compound concept of pouvoir savoir, power knowledge, produced by Foucault. And the gradual extension of the apparatuses of discipline and their, quote, multiplication throughout the social body ushers in the disciplinary society. The paradigmatic concretization of disciplinary power is Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, an architectural form which submits inmates to the constant gaze of the invisible guard and thereby impels them to conform their behavior to institutional expectations. The panopticon can be applied indifferently to workshops, schools, prisons, quote, every time we are dealing with a multiplicity of individuals to whom one must impose a task or conduct. It is, again, to quote Foucault, an intensifier of power at the same time as a multiplier of production. And its dissemination transports the carceral form outside the penitentiary. Thus, we see this diffusion of judges of normality are present everywhere. We are in the society of the teacher judge, the doctor judge, the educator judge, the social worker judge. They all foster the reign of the universality of the normative. In the midst of all these tightening mechanisms of normalization, and here is a surprising proposition by Foucault, the specificity of the prison and its role as a seal lose their raison d'être. And this is, 4th proposition, what makes Surveiller et Punir a strangely self-refuting book. Of what use is the prison when, quote, disciplinary coercion already impregnates the gamut of institutions from schools and hospitals to asylums, barracks, and workshops, and has fabricated a disciplinary individual. Indeed, it is revealing that the penitentiary makes its first full-fledged appearance in the book only on page 268, and indeed who needs judicial penalty in the kingdom of infra-penality and disciplines. And lastly, but an important proposition that I will keep from Foucault is the idea that the prison separates out different forms of illegalities. It is a dividing institution. It creates salient social cleavages and marks out a distinctive population, the delinquents, and creates a new social type, the criminal, which enters into the public imagination, an imagination fastened on the city's underbelly and its festering threats it harbors. And lastly, penal power, like all power, is not just repressive, but also productive. It generates new social relations, institutions, bodies of knowledge, and subjectivities. This means that the imprint of the penal state on society goes far beyond those directly or indirectly touched by the police, the court, and the prison. On this count, Durkheim, Rouche, and Foucault vary on the specifics, but they agree on the weight and the shaping power of criminal justice on the social body. Now let's look at, so we have these two punishment paradigms. On the one side, we have, for Marxists and other rationalists, penalty is a material agency serving class interests through the control of labor. It is an instrument of class domination, connecting economy and society, stamping profane reality. This approach is a variant of utilitarianism descended from Jeremy Bentham, in that it treats both the state and the criminal as rational actors seeking to maximize efficiency and utility. By contrast, on the right-hand side, for the Durkheimians and assorted emotionalists, punishment is a symbolic agency expressing the passion of the community whose boundaries it brightens and solidarity it reinforces. It draws on and in turns it feeds the sense of the sacred that enshrouds shared values. And it situates itself in the lineage of Kantian penality based on deontological principles, starting with the categorical imperative and the principle of proportionality, jus talionis, which the penal state must uphold. Now, these theoretical oppositions are replicated at the level of philosophies of punishment by the antinomy between consequentialism, also called utilitarianism, descended precisely from Jeremy Bentham, yielding rehabilitation or reformation, and retributivism on the other side, descended from Immanuel Kant, one variant of which is the philosophy of just desert. For reformation or rehabilitation and retribution are two philosophies corresponding to the rationalist and the emotionalist theories of punishment respectively, and suited, as we shall see later, to the left hand and the right hand of the state. And so we see this reformation is a prospective or consequentialist philosophy. It is based on an expansive social reading of criminality which situates the defendant in society and uses punishment as a flexible tool for improving future behavior. It is the philosophy of punishment fostered by the left hand of the state, the hand that protects. It stands in affinity with the rationalist theory of punishment running from Beccaria to Bentham to Rouche. By contrast, retribution is a retrospective philosophy of punishment. It focuses not on the future behavior of the criminal, but on the past, on the crime that already happened. And it provides a strictly legal reading of criminality. It focuses not on the future, but on the past, not on the offender, but on the offense. It is the philosophy of punishment suited to the right hand of the state, the hand that disciplines. It stands in elective affinity with the emotionalist theory of penalty running from Kant to Durkheim to contemporary neo-Durkheimians such as David Garland. Now on paper, again, this opposition between reformation and retribution, rationality and emotionality seems insurmountable. But in the everyday workings of the justice apparatus, it is overcome by applying each to a different sphere of criminality. There exists, so to speak, a philosophical and a practical division in the labor of punishment, according to the mundane or the sacred character of the offense, reinforced by the low or the high social status of the offender and the victim. On the one hand, penal sanctions for low-level crimes, garden variety misdemeanors, such as petty theft, drug possession, driving under the influence of alcohol, and public order disruption, these penal sanctions stand toward rationality and instrumentality. They are emotionally cold and consequentialist in that they aim to channel mundane behavior by deterring ordinary offenses and reducing the chance of their reiteration. They partake of what I call the profane Benthamite penality. But by contrast, the penal sanctions addressed to grievous felonies, serious crimes infringing on the sanctity of the human person, such as aggravated assault, rape, or murder, these are driven by hot emotions, and they partake of sacred Kantian penality. They purport to protect the sanctified values and dramatize absolute principles by casting the offender out of the human community. Since the consequentialist and the retributivist models of punishment are both at play at the same time in the routine operation of the criminal court, instead of opposing them, we need to combine them to account for the full span of penalty. So now I've dug into social theories of punishment and philosophies of punishment. Let us now turn to theories of the state. Theories of the state, I've argued previously that with precious few exceptions, theories of the state have ignored penalty, and theorists of penalty have ignored the state. Now let me turn to 4 theorists of the state who provide conceptual tools for building a robust concept of the penal state. The 4 are Max Weber, Michael Mann, James Scott, and Pierre Bourdieu, who's not in the picture there, but don't worry, he's going to come. Now, Max Weber, this is a classic. You can't give a lecture on the state or on the penal state without starting with good old Max. Weber's foundational definition of the state in Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft spotlights 4 elements: force, staff, legitimacy, and territory. Weber also writes that among the basic functions of the state, he enumerates, quote, the establishment of the law, legislature, the protection and personal security and public order, the police, the maintenance of established law, the judiciary, and the pursuit of hygienic, pedagogic, social policy, and other cultural interests, the various branches of administration. Finally, of course, also organized external defense, military administration. Weber notes that the law differs from convention by the intercession of, quote, the staff, which could hold itself specifically ready for action, meant to guarantee obedience. And here he gives us an example, such as judges, prosecutors, policemen, and sheriffs. I believe I'm the first person to have kind of dug up these quotation out of Weber's work. But this is only Weber's only passing mention of criminal justice. He has no theory of the penal state per se, but we can draw on this work to begin to articulate one. And I propose an amended reading of Weber. I propose to pluralize the territories over which the staff of the state rules, which pluralizes the boundaries to be patrolled, which pluralizes the population and raises the question where and in whose eyes is legitimacy of the penal state to be assessed. And you remember, Rouche's notion that not everybody sees the state as their state, sees the law as their law, and not everybody will see the state as a legitimate agency wielding force. Second theorist that I'm going to draw on is Michael Mann on infrastructural power. In his path-breaking book, The Sources of Social Power, the British sociologist Michael Mann builds a grand historical theory of the state from agrarian to post-industrial societies and introduces a fruitful distinction between what he calls despotic power and infrastructural power, which I propose to apply to contemporary penalty. By despotic power, Mann designates, quote, the range of actions which the elite is empowered to undertake without routine institutionalized negotiation with civil society groups. And by infrastructural power, he means the capacity of the state to actually penetrate civil society and to implement logistically political decisions throughout the realm. Mann proposes that despotic power has fluctuated widely in history, while infrastructural power has grown exponentially in modern societies in which the state has developed the informational, bureaucratic, and ideological capacities to monitor populations and shape individual conduct in granular fashion. Now, remarkably and typically, Mann's account contains not a word on criminal justice agencies as vehicles for societal penetration. So I propose that the police, court, and prison are, alongside social welfare and public health, the chief means whereby the state penetrates the lower regions of social and physical space and regulates the life of the urban precariat. And I will add, the precariat residing in neighborhoods of relegation experiences the penetrative power of the infrastructural state as despotic. So the two concepts kind of meet at the point of application of penal power. Now let's move to our third theorist, James Scott on legibility. According to James Scott's landmark book, Seeing Like a State, modern states have designed and deployed a whole series of contraptions to order society, to standardize ordinary relations and funnel practices to make them, quote, legible. I want to suggest that the penal wing of the state is the eye that makes legible the underbelly of the city and provides a narrative to make it fit with dominant values. The underclass, the Unterklasse, is portrayed as the living, walking, breathing antithesis of property, propriety, family, individual responsibility, and moral respectability. A judge, and so in my third lecture, I'll take you inside of the California criminal court, in which a judge explains what we do is, he writes, he says, we are traveling in the sewers of society on a glass-bottom boat, you know, which has this very idea of we are reading the underbelly of the society. James Scott writes, these state simplifications, the basic givens of modern statecraft, were like a bridged map, represented only that slice of reality that interested the official observer. They were maps that would enable much of the reality they depicted to be remade. So now bring together Michael Mann and James Scott, and you discover that there exists a relationship of mutual reinforcement between infrastructural power and legibility, whereby each amplifies and deepens the other. Infrastructural power allows the penal state agents to insert themselves in the life of the precariat, thus fostering legibility in the forms of files and records. Legibility in terms facilitates insertion and makes it deeper and more efficient. So let's keep this idea that the penal state is an infrastructural device that penetrates and makes legible the lower regions of social and physical space as territory where state force is applied and state legitimacy is problematic. Now, where shall we locate this penal wing of the state? How does it fit into the architecture of the modern Leviathan? We can now turn to Pierre Bourdieu to answer this question. Bourdieu offers all the needed analytical tools to hone an expansive notion of criminal punishment as the public delivery of conjoint material force, material violence, force, and symbolic violence, stigma. On my reading, in his lecture course at the Collège de France sur l'État, über den Staat, the French sociologist fashions not one, but we are lucky, three models of the state, each yielding a flexible conceptual tool we can employ to forge a robust construct of the penal state, building on Weber, Mann, and Scott. These three models are the genetic model of the transition of the house of the king to the reason of state, attendant on the rise of the bureaucratic over the dynastic mode of reproduction, of rule. Based on the autonomization of cultural capital, this genetic model yields the concept of bureaucratic field. The second model is the functional model of the right hand and the left hand of the state, corresponding to the masculine disciplinary and the feminine protective missions of the Leviathan, respectively, a duality that characterizes liberal democratic states across the continents. And the third model is the structural model of the state as what he calls the central bank of symbolic capital, which operates as the fount of efficient classification, identity and honor or dishonor, the vehicle for the monopolization of capital over capital, and the engine behind the invention of the universal. I'm going to draw on all three of these concepts, construct my model of the penal state in 3 steps. First, I will articulate the homology between the polar organization of the bureaucratic field and the dual opposition between penal actors and their philosophies of punishment. Second, I will locate the police, the court, and the prison in the right hand of the state. And third, I will focus on the dual character of state classification as bestowing positive and negative credentials, aura, or stigma. So this part gets a little rocky because I had too much material to try to fit. First notion, so I'm going to call them Bourdieu 1, Bourdieu 2, and Bourdieu 3. Bourdieu 1, the bureaucratic field. First notion is penality in the bureaucratic field. Like all fields, the bureaucratic field is not a monolith. It's a historical space organized by oppositions. It is a space of forces and a space of struggles. Consider 2 properties specific to the bureaucratic field which apply to the penal state as one of its components. First, the monopoly of a legitimate symbolic violence. The state is for Bourdieu first and foremost the agency, quote, that successfully claims the monopoly over the legitimate use of material and symbolic violence in a given territory on the totality of the corresponding population. You will have recognized here Max Weber's definition with the crucial addition of symbolic violence in addition to material violence. This is Bourdieu's crucial extension. In advanced societies, the school and the law are the chief public institutions that respectively inculcate and validate the categories legitimizing the social order by making it appear as the only possible configuration. The penal triad of the police, the court, and the prison is the agency that partakes in this monopoly and diffuses the negative identity of the criminal as the antagonist of the citizen. Second proposition, the definition and the distribution of public goods. The bureaucratic field is the locus of the authority to define and distribute public goods. What could be more public than public safety, public order, and moral propriety? In advanced societies, punishment aimed at the production of public order and safety, the enforcement of moral propriety, think of sexual crimes, for instance, and the staging of sovereignty and the projection of legitimacy is both an indispensable service and a doggedly public function that every minimally functioning state must imperatively provide. Thomas Hobbes and Norbert Elias were right. Only the Leviathan can durably pacify social space through the institution and deployment of its penal wing, which is the hidden foundation for full-fledged economic development, social differentiation, and psychic individualization, as demonstrated by Elias in his dissection of the civilizing process over 8 centuries. We can see that, a contrario, with the situation of failing states. Failing states are states that minimally fail to establish a functioning and legitimate triad of police, court, and prison. Yet, remarkably, the leading student of failing states, Robert Bates, devotes not one line on the incapacity of African states to develop a functioning penal triad. Similarly, in their synthetic study entitled State Failure in the Modern World, Zaryab Iqbal and Harvey Starr mention the police only in passing alongside the military, and they ignore criminal justice as a core function of a functioning state. So here I'm going to propose 4 key propositions. First, the penal triad is epicentral to the state's capacity to secure a monopoly over legitimate violence. The penal triad is organized around a polar opposition between autonomy, the law, nothing but the law, and heteronomy, make room for social forces in the calibration and delivery of punishment. Third proposition, the prismatic capacity of the state will be critical to ward off the demands of politics, the media, and interest groups to drive justice, structure, and policy. So now, I had a whole series of diagrams to walk you through social space. At the top of social space, you have the field of power. Inside of the field of power, here's the field of power. You have the bureaucratic field in the middle. then you go inside of the bureaucratic field and you get this structure, you know, with these two dimensions, and you have the opposition between the private and the privates. And so finally you get to the left hand and right hand. So this is Bourdieu too. The right hand and the left hand of the penal state. The second model of the state proposed by Bourdieu is the schema of the two hands. Let me develop this metaphorical opposition into a more articulated conceptual map of the internal structure of the penal state. The functioning of the bureaucratic field is subtended by the structural opposition between the right hand and the left hand of the state. The left hand is the protective side of Leviathan. It defends social rights, seeks collective solutions to social problems by the delivery of public services. It is materialized by the Ministry of Public Education, Health, Housing, Social Welfare, Labor Law, that is, the ministries which offer support and solidarity to the populations deprived of economic and cultural capital. The left hand is maternalist, in that it seeks to nurture the population and foster its collective well-being by sheltering it from the naked sanctions of the market. The right hand of the state is the disciplinary side of the Leviathan, entrusted with enforcing order, and in the neoliberal era, with applying fiscal austerity and market deregulation. It stresses individual solutions to collective problems and activates market mechanism. It is paternalist, in that it imposes authoritarian controls over individuals and prioritizes civic obligations over social rights. For Bourdieu, so this is the opposition between the left hand and the right hand of the state, the right hand of discipline, the left hand of protection. And for Bourdieu, the right hand is incarnated by the Ministry of the Budget. And I feel a void in his model by inserting here the military, the police, the courts, and the prison, which are missing from his model. You can't reproach Bourdieu for not having done it. I think he did enough with his sociology. Can't do it all. So now zoom inside. So let's now zoom. So this is the bureaucratic field, and this here would be So this is inside of now the same structure of opposition between the left hand and the right hand is replicated inside of the penal state itself. Criminal justice wing of the state is itself a field stretched along the two dimensions of volume and composition of penal capital, organized by oppositions homologous to the oppositions that structure the bureaucratic field as a whole. The right hand of the penal state is the masculine agent of discipline. It is anchored by the legal pole of autonomy, occupied by the criminal court level, by the public prosecutor, who prioritizes judicial over social concerns. It stands to favor retribution as a philosophy of punishment. Then the left hand of the penal state is the feminine agent of protection. It is anchored by the social pole of heteronomy, occupied by public and private defense attorneys who battle to prioritize social over legal concerns. It tends to favor reformation and rehabilitation as the operative philosophy of punishment. So now if I had a little bit more time, so you can see that, so you have the bureaucratic field with this opposition, left hand, right hand. If you go inside of the right hand, you find the penal state. If you go inside of the penal state, you find a similar homologous opposition between the left hand and the right hand of the state. If I had a little more time, if it was 5 lectures instead of 3, I would take you through this diagram, which shows that there's one more level. This is the fractal, what I call the fractal structure of the penal state, is that when you get into the office of the public prosecutor, and you get into the office of the public defender, court-appointed attorneys, you find that each of these offices itself is also organized around an opposition between a protective left hand and a retributive right hand. For those of you who want to stick around, that will be the topic of lecture number 3. So let's get to Bourdieu number 3. Bourdieu number 3 is symbolic capital and negative sociodicy. The third model is the central bank of symbolic capital. Bourdieu explains how through a double process of concentration and centralization, the state comes to supersede or subsume other forms of public repute, prestige, and honor. So many names for symbolic capital. In particular, the state monopolizes the capacity to utter and to enforce the law, to create identities and to grant titles, which sanctify the established visions and divisions of the social world. Bourdieu characterizes this quasi-magical power, and he speaks of le pouvoir de nomination, the power to nominate, which has the triple meaning of naming, appointing to an official position, and selecting for an award. Here we come full circle back to the monopoly and the delivery of legitimate symbolic violence. And you can see in this quote from Bourdieu that he talks about the power of nomination as a power of social creation, which brings the person nominated into existence in accordance with the nomination. It is a quasi-magical power. Now, Bourdieu focuses on the bestowal of positive symbolic capital, that is, assignment to a valorized identity, elevating the person thus named or nominated in the eyes of others, and attesting to their social worth and their moral virtue, one of the many definitions of honor. He writes, this process of concentration of symbolic capital operated by the state culminates in the power of nomination, the power to award decorations, credentials, titles of bureaucratic nobility, such as the Legion of Honor, or academic titles. But just like there is a dark side to the dialectic, there's a dark side to the state. And the power of nomination can just be as well be wielded to assign a negative identity, one tarnished by official stigma and backed by public bureaucracy. This is exactly what is involved in a criminal conviction. The criminal conviction strips the defendant of the honor of citizenship and casts him out of the civic community. It is an act of negative nomination and bureaucratic desecration. The court procedure of the entry of the guilty plea, the reading of the verdict of the jury, the sentencing of the defendant are variants on what Harold Garfinkel famously called degradation ceremonies. So it should be clear by now, hopefully, that punishment is not just a topic for the study of crime and deviance, but a central chapter in the sociology of the state and the theory of group making. Penal sanctions do not just inflict pain, they exact a form of public dishonor, and they draw categorical divisions between insiders and outsiders in the civic community. This is what links them organically with ethnicity, a topic I will address in my second lecture tomorrow. Indeed, race as denegated ethnicity is also a form of public dishonor, which helps explain the fact that punishment everywhere targets populations both destitute and stigmatized, a dimension that materialist theories of punishment, such as neo-Marxist and neoclassical political economy, are incapable of grasping. Indeed, in the symbolic register, we can understand penality as negative sociodicy. So what is this strange notion of negative sociodicy? Don't worry, I'm not going to let you leave the room without knowing what it is. The term theodicy was coined by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in his effort to show that the existence of evil does not contradict the goodness of God, an aporia inherited from medieval theology which vexed him throughout his life. The notion of theodicy was reformulated by Max Weber in his Sociology of Religion, which introduces a dichotomous distinction between the theodicy of good fortune, Theodice des Glückes, and the theodicy of suffering or misfortune, Theodice des Leidens. And the two theodicies for Weber serve the same function, to justify privilege at the top and deprivation at the bottom, therefore perpetuating social hierarchy. Now, in his work, so we go from Leibniz to Weber to now Bourdieu. In his work on higher education, Bourdieu secularizes the notion and speaks of sociodicy instead of theodicy, the legitimation of the existing order via the consecration of inherited cultural capital bestowed by elite schools. Now we can reintroduce Weber's dual conception of Theodicy into Bourdieu's view of the state as the fount of honor, to discover that the prison operates as the fulcrum of negative sociodicy, the public legitimation of the dereliction of the rejects of the market, by extending to them the trope of individual responsibility and demerit that anchors the positive sociodicy effected by the higher education system at the other end of the class structure. In other words, the prison can be understood as a kind of a negative university, bestowing certificates of discredit, justifying the truncation of the life conditions and life chances of those struck at the penal law. So you have on the one side elite schools, provide the positive sociodicy of the privileges of the dominant, gives them honorific titles, attesting to their merits, expanding their life chances of their graduates, endowing them with aura, and these inspiring collective awe on the positive side and envy on the negative side. The holders of elite diplomas are what Bourdieu calls a state nobility, a closed and honorific group at the top of the class structure, sanctified by the state, and thereby separated from the common and the vulgar that is partaking of the sacred in the Durkheimian sense. At the other end of the social order, the prison, as the negative university, provides the negative sociodicy of social suffering, using the same criteria of merit, only in the case of marginal populations, spotlighting the alleged lack of talent and intelligence, the deficient work ethic, and the moral flaws of those who are sanctioned. The criminal record, the rap sheet, the casier judiciaire in France, the Führungszeugnis in Germany, the Casellario Giudiziale, justifies the dire condition and the truncation of the life chances of the convict, both within and beyond carceral walls. It inflicts upon him a stigma that nourishes feelings of shame, the collective emotion attached to a negative sociodicy, to the criminal justice sanction, are fear on the negative side and pity on the positive side. And whereas graduates of elite schools are the embodiment of purity, the graduates of the prison are what we could call state pariahs. They are living bearers of pollution and incarnations of danger, justifying their social ostracization and moral castigation. They are on the side of the profane. So now we're pretty close to the end. We're going to know what the penal state is. I promised it. I will deliver on my promise. You may not like the answer, but I'll give you an answer. We now come to this definition. The penal state is the sector of the bureaucratic field that successfully monopolizes the legitimate means to interpret and enforce criminal statutes, therefore curating crime in the sense that it selects, manipulates, and exhibits it for order maintenance, bureaucratic expediency, civic instruction, and political profit. This enforcement entails the joint delivery of concentrated material violence, force, and concentrated symbolic violence, stigma, trained on violators, but reaching also those connected to them, what I call the social halo effect, and the spaces they inhabit, the territorial effect. The penal state is a site of struggles over the definition and the delivery of justice, and it contains within itself the polarity of Benthamite reformation and Kantian retribution. There's no better illustration of this kind of war going on inside of the penal state between these two conceptions of justice than the German Penal Code. German Penal Code, Article 46. I'm going to read you that article. The offender and the offender's blameworthiness shall be the basis for sentencing. The court shall take into account the effect that the punishment is expected to have on the offender's future life in society. You have on the one side the section, in sense, giving you a Kantian reading of penalty. The offender's blameworthiness shall be the basis for sentencing. This is retribution. This is just desert. And the next sentence, the court shall take into account the effects that the punishment is expected to have on the offender's future life in society. This is Bentham. This is rehabilitation. This is the impact of punishment on the future conduct of the convict. The penal state is the site of this struggle and contains within itself the polarity of Benthamite reformation and Kantian retribution. Finally, the penal leviathan penetrates and renders legible the underbelly of the city and projects a symbolic opposition between the deserving citizen and the undeserving criminal. Now, the three structural properties of the penal state, and I'm going to leave you with that. First property, I said, polarized. So, I had that long definition. See, sometimes it's good to have a short definition, sometimes it's good to have a long definition, covering the whole ground. So, first property, lodged securely in the right hand of the state. Like every field, the penal sector is polarized between two possible missions carried out by the pole of autonomy, pure law, tending towards retribution, and the pole of heteronomy, applied law, tending towards reformation. There is at every moment a struggle between agents situated at these two poles over the purpose and the priority of punishment, just desert or rehabilitation, or some dynamic combination of these two philosophies. For instance, the policeman, who is one incarnation of the penal state, can understand his job as either being a guardian or being a warrior. The probation officer can see his work as being a social worker or as being a policeman. Second property, the penal state is Janus-faced in that it delivers two opposite services at once, the one positive and the other negative. To the citizenry at large, the law-abiding and deserving citizenry, the penal state purports to provide a public good in the form of generalized crime prevention, as well as firm support for individual responsibility, social propriety, and moral respectability. It operates in the manner of a shield against disorder. But to its clientele, namely suspects, defendants, and convicts, who are by definition undeserving, the penal state delivers a private bad in the form of targeted physical and psychic pain. It is not a shield, but a sword, unsheathed to frighten would-be offenders, deterrence, neutralize scofflaws, incapacitation, retrain convicts, rehabilitation, and hurt violators, retribution. This two-sidedness is inescapable and irreducible. It is a normal and not a pathological feature of the penal state. This means that at bottom, the legitimacy of the penal state is structurally compromised, as shown by a long lineage of studies of quote, legal cynicism among the usual target population of the police and the court. Third property, also I had a little diagram, but it was too complicated, so I didn't want to show you. So the first property is the top diagram where you see the opposition between the pole of autonomy and the pole of heteronomy, and that's polarization. The second is the Janus face, turn on the one side towards the offender, turns on the other sides towards the citizenry at large. And the third property is the penal state is emphatically not a unified institution functioning in a consistent manner across social divisions, quite the opposite. As I will show tomorrow, the representations that guide it, the statutes it stipulates, and the actions that it takes are systematically differentiated by class, ethnicity, and place. This is the case in every society for which we have the requisite data, and it goes back all the way to the budding of the prison in the late 16th century. The penal state is not just polarized and two-faced, it is also bifurcated, its third structural property. To understand this bifurcation, it's fruitful to draw on the work of the legal scholar Marcus Dubber. In his 2018 book, The Dual Penal State, Dubber proposes that there are two ways of interpreting the criminal process, translating into two modes of penal governance, law, Gesetz, and police, Polizei, Recht. So the Rechtsstaat is anchored in legal autonomy, equality, and interpersonal respect, producing principled punishment. The Polizeistaat is grounded in legal heteronomy, hierarchy, and patriarchal power, generating punitive discipline. Now, for Dubber, this duality is juridical and not social. It is rooted in the interpretive dualism of criminal procedure. Dubber does not realize that, in fact, it expresses the dualization of penality across social and physical space. Legal governance applies to the bourgeoisie and the corporations and ethnic insiders, who are treated as subjects and citizens endowed with rights guaranteed by the law, Rechts. Police governance applies to the proletariat and the ethnic outsiders who experience penalty first and foremost as the arbitrary and capricious force of the police, Polizei. So to conclude, the structural complexity and the built-in dynamism of the penal state, rooted in the contradictory pool of autonomy and heteronomy, the tension between public good and private bad, and the interplay of law and police as class-based modes of governance, explains that the penal state can serve multiple functions simultaneously beyond its penological mission, necessitating the coupling of consequentialist and retributivist theories of punishment. The penal state curates criminality, sweeps up the urban rejects of the market, the homeless, poor addicts, the mentally ill, irregular migrants, and raises the cost of involvement in the street economy. It brightens the social boundaries and broadcasts morality, and it legitimizes misfortune by the bestowal of negative credentials. Last but not least, the penal state serves to project sovereignty and to shore up the deficit of legitimacy that politicians suffer when they roll back the economic and social protections of the Leviathan. This twin role is central to the resurgence of the prison on the institutional horizon of advanced societies over the past half-century, a historical puzzle to which I will turn in my second lecture, so you are all invited, as I turn from social theory to the social history of penalty, trying to produce what Foucault would call a history of the present of penalty. Thank you very much.